Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let everyone get a chance to join in. Just another minute or so, allow everyone a chance to log in. Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And yes, there's some questions about whether you'll be receiving the recording afterwards. You absolutely will. We will link it in an email that we will be sending out after the webinar is complete. Just a reminder to put any questions you may have in the using the Q&A function. That keeps it easier for us to organize, but you may also have a question in chat, but we would prefer it if you would use the Q&A function. And also, why don't everyone put it in the chat where you're logging in from today? And it's 12:01 Eastern Time PM, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're very happy that you're here. We know it's been a tough time, but we hope you're doing well, or as well as you can be. So in this webcast, obviously we're covering AWS Serverless Application Model and how to deploy AWS Lambda applications. My name is Newt. I am on the marketing team here at GitLab. I am from Durham, North Carolina, USA, and I'm the moderator today. So say hi, don't be shy. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We love questions, so please put them in the Q&A using the Q&A function. There's a little button that says Q&A. Please use that to ask questions. And we will have a dedicated time for questions at the end of the webcast. We're going to try and get through as many as we can in the time that we have allotted, which is about an hour. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function to get in touch with me. And let me present our esteemed presenters today. We have Ram Dileepan. He's a senior partner solutions architect at AWS, and Brendan O'Leary, senior developer evangelist at GitLab. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brendan to start our poll.
Thanks, Newt. Appreciate it. And again, welcome everyone. I'm calling in from the East Coast of the US in Maryland. And our poll question today is, how is your organization using serverless today? And we've got a number of answers there. If everyone could just take a quick moment to answer that question. We just kind of want to get a feel for everyone's familiarity and use case for serverless today. We'll just give it a few more moments for folks to answer that. Thanks for saying hi in the chat as well. Great to see people from all over the world joining today. Happy to have you here.
All right, Brendan, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll.
Awesome, thanks.
And I'm going to share the results with everyone.
Great, thanks for sharing. And thanks everyone for voting. It helps Ram and I understand where everyone's coming from. It looks like most of the folks are kind of in the middle of the road, right? They're maybe using serverless in a few use cases or considering it to be part of their stack in the future. And I love that 8 of you are asking, what is serverless? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ram to answer just that kind of question.
Hello, everyone. This is Ram Dileepan. I'm one of the senior solutions architects here at AWS. I'm based out of New York. I work with companies like GitLab. I'm going to talk a little bit about modern application development and serverless and how GitLab actually fits into this. And before I hand over to Brendan to talk more about what we are really going to talk about today is about using GitLab to implement CI/CD pipeline. If you can go to the next slide. So the modern application development, the main goal of modern application development is to automate and abstract away as much as possible from customers, so they can focus on building, applications to meet their business needs. So what we do is that we, as an AWS cloud, we abstract a lot of the details from developers, so they can actually focus on building applications instead of working with infrastructure, setting up infrastructure, and so forth. And so this actually leads to the next slide, which is the rapid innovation, right? This actually helps rapid innovation because you can actually focus on building applications, quickly bring them up and test them, and go back to experimenting to come up with a solution that actually meets the business requirement. So that, and the rapid, Brendan, if you can go to the next slide. So rapid innovation is a requirement now. It's not really a luxury, right? So you want to be able to very quickly experiment, get the feedback, and go back to ideas and get them into production as fast as you can. So the modern application development really helps you with that kind of pace that you need to keep up with. If you can go to the next slide, the first part of that is going one slide before that. There is a, okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so, and the next slide, the slide after, please, thank you. Okay, so going from monolithic application to microservices. And so that's the first phase. So everyone is aware of what is monolithic application. They're big applications, they are single, and they handle a lot of the functionality for organizations, but they come up with some of the limitations, such as it's rigid scaling, and any change is high impact because it impacts the entire application. And also it's hard to adopt new technologies because you have to impact many components within the monolithic application. From there, we move to microservices. The services actually does one thing at a time, and they actually deployed independently, and they can scale independently. For instance, you think about, like, let's say you have a microservice which actually calculates just the tax or shipping, sales tax for each shipment. You can actually just scale that part depending on what you need very quickly. And you don't have to worry about impacting the rest of the application. And also the changes are small and it's limited to that particular service. And of course, you can use choice of technology that you need for that particular service. So we always strongly believe in purpose-built technology for different use cases. So that actually helps you build that as well with the microservices. Now, at Amazon, we actually very closely follow this principle, and the service teams are, or the teams that develop these microservices are very small. We call them 2 pizza teams, basically a team which can be fed by 2 pizzas, which means that 10 to 12 people, normally they actually write the application, they also own and operate the application. That actually gives the benefit of like understanding what's happening in production, going back, actually addressing any issues which come up very quickly. Now, going into the next slide, this is about serverless. So now going from the microservices that don't have to be serverless, but now we are moving into serverless. This is a famous quote from our CTO: "No server is easier to manage than no server at all." So this means that, of course, the users or the developers don't have to manage the servers, but of course we do manage them in the background for them. So what it means is that really the no servers to provision or manage from a developer perspective, it is taken care of for them. And it scales with usage. You don't have to add servers when you need additional capacity. You're running 10 Lambda functions or 100, it actually scales. And then also you just pay as you run the Lambda function. You don't need to pay for anything that don't run. So let's say the 2 hours of the day, you don't have anything running because your traffic is low, you don't need to pay for it. And also we have availability and fault tolerance built into it. So you don't have to worry about that. It is taken care of it for you as well. Now, if you go to the next slide, so this is the standard the development cycle. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the idea here is that even if you go to serverless, even when you go to serverless, you can actually still follow the standard development best practices, right? So if you go to the next slide, so these are the right three best practices to start with when you go to microservices. Treat your infrastructure the way that you treat your code. Always infrastructure as code, go through the standard procedure to deploy the code. And set up an automated integration and deployment pipeline. That's what today's webinar is mostly about. So that's why it's in green. And Brendan is going to talk a lot about, but he's going to focus specifically on serverless applications using SAM and how do you actually use GitLab to deploy and build and deploy these applications as a pipeline into production. The next one is I want to emphasize that also when you build microservices, you have to build the monitoring and observability from the day one. It cannot be an afterthought. When you design the application, you have to design how are you going to monitor it, what are you going to monitor, and something that actually you have to start from the beginning. Every time when I develop an application, for instance, I always, since the beginning, I have something called a monitoring strategy document, so which actually kind of outlines as you develop or design actually how this application is going to be monitored. So it's very important that you start from the day one, not as an afterthought. Now, having said that, I'll hand over to Brendan to talk about how do you use GitLab for integration and deployment pipeline for serverless application using SAM. Brendan, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ram. I really appreciate it. And that's a fantastic introduction to serverless and how to think about the differences between a monolithic application and a microservices-based application. And like Ram said, I'm going to spend some time kind of talking in more detail about how that might look in a real-world use case. And as I mentioned, I'm coming to you from Maryland on the East Coast of the United States today. I'm a senior developer evangelist at GitLab. Really looking forward to all of your questions. I think those are really valuable in helping us, make this webinar as valuable as possible to all of you. And honestly, as much as I like hearing myself talk, it's even better to be able to chat with and answer questions from all of you. So don't be shy. Use that Q&A function. We're going to leave plenty of time for that at the end of the presentation. And if you have further questions after that, I've put here how you can reach me after today. So on Twitter, I'm O'Leary Crew, or on GitLab, I'm just Brendan. So just kind of to piggyback off what Ram was telling us, right? I think, the critical thing and the reason that folks are talking about, microservices or serverless or some of these other cloud native technologies, I think is because, it was almost 9 years ago now when Mark Andreessen was quoted as saying software is eating the world. I would say it has now eaten the world. And because of that, the competitiveness of your businesses depend on how fast your teams can deliver code, which is to say how quickly they can create customer value. And I think accelerating that rate of innovation in all industries increases competitiveness and also lowers the barrier to entry. And I think executive leaders acknowledge this and know that software is powering businesses and is the critical path item to business success. And not only does iterating rapidly allow you to respond to the market and changing conditions, it also allows you to kind of skate to where the puck is going to be, to use a hockey analogy. If you're able to change quickly, you're able to get more quickly and more accurately to the optimal solution rather than what you thought the right solution was. And so that is another reason that folks are really looking at, cloud native technologies. But of course, as Ram said, those technologies can't exist just in a bubble. It's great for a demonstration, but to really operationalize it in the enterprise, we have to have DevOps best practices built in, no matter how we're deploying the code in the end, right? And so that's where GitLab can come in and help bring those DevOps best practices from the hundreds of thousands of organizations that use GitLab And, we have an opinionated flow about how DevOps should work and how you can optimize for the entire cycle time using our tools. And AWS is a great partner for deploying that, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. The reason this is so critical, and I've spent time in the beginning thinking about this, is because some folks might say that, well, serverless is just a bunch of functions, so it's less critical. Well, I would argue it's actually more critical. As we move to microservices, we are actually increasing the complexity of our systems, right? If we break up the monolith slowly and move some of those things the monolith is doing into smaller services, we're actually increasing the fragmentation of data, of our teams, of where we have to be concerned about operational issues. And of course, those are hopefully going to have us realizing those benefits of being able to move to market faster and leveraging cloud providers such as AWS for what they're great at, which, as Ram pointed out, is getting the compute out of the way and really allowing the developers to focus on shipping code to their users and thus shipping value. And so that's, I think, really the real focus. And that's where this fantastic tool that we're going to talk about today from AWS and called SAM and GitLab really shine together. So SAM is a tool that AWS created to help developers create and deploy serverless applications. Because, as we know, serverless is pretty easy to get started with, right? Lambda has become almost the industry standard term for serverless. I say it's kind of like the Kleenex of the serverless world, right? We say Kleenex and mean tissue or facial tissue, and we say Lambda and we mean serverless. But SAM provides a CLI that helps us kind of take the power of Lambda and the rest of the AWS stack to the next level. So this CLI allows us to do local testing, right, which is something that's really critical and maybe a little bit different in a serverless environment. And then also allows to deploy to AWS in an automated fashion. And it allows us to define the resources that we need as code. So that includes the serverless functions, but can also include any of the rest of the AWS suite of tools, because in the end, what it's going to do is take all of those things and create a CloudFormation stack from that SAM template and automatically deploy those various functions and other AWS components and get the IAM configured correctly between all of them so that our application can run not only Lambda functions, but also leverage the rest of the AWS stack to create an entire system and application, right? And so let's talk about how it works. Well, getting started with SAM is very, very simple. So we can install the CLI. It, of course, installs cross-platform. And then SAM init gives us a lot of options about how we want to get started. So AWS has provided a number of quick start templates here, kind of for any language you can name, or well, it's for any language that runs in Lambda, that's for sure. And that was really helpful to me because while I know a little bit of Python, I'm really at heart a Node.js developer, for better or worse. I know some are judging me probably in the audience, that's okay. And so it was great for me because a lot of the examples that you see on the internet are going to be in Python, which is fine. But it was great to have this starter template that I could start with, Node.js 12x to really get started on coding in a comfortable environment for me. And this, I think, applies directly to the enterprise because, again, those teams are going to be diverse. They're going to have different needs. They're going to choose the language that best fits those needs. And so this allows them all to get started really easily. So from there, SAM creates, the project directory, initializes it, creates a hello world Lambda function to get us started, and gives us the command to be able to run that function locally. And so that's really great because it, again, shows you a full working example. And with Docker running on my machine, it pulls down the Lambda Docker image to allow me to run that Lambda function directly on my machine, which is really valuable when I'm getting started with development and testing. After that, as I want to, deploy the application, there's a simple two-step process where I issue the command SAM build, and it wraps up all of the artifacts into a build directory for me, including the template that gets turned into a CloudFormation stack, as well as all of the artifacts from my build, whether that's my Java jars, or in my case, just some JavaScript files. Whatever those artifacts are, it's going to wrap those up and prepare them for deploy. And then with a SAM deploy, it actually then goes and deploys that stack. So of course I can set things like my AWS region, and then from there, SAM automatically uses the credentials that I've already authenticated to with AWS on my laptop to create an S3 bucket, deploy the template to there, and then run the CloudFormation stack from that template to bring in all of the correct IAM permissions, all of the correct tools that I'm be using. I had a question come through that I think is relative to answer right now, which is, what is a CloudFormation stack? That's a great question. So CloudFormation is AWS's infrastructure as code tooling that you can both, you can code infrastructure in YAML or JSON. They also have a visual editor for it. And so you can kind of think of it as like an AWS specific Terraform or Ansible that really helps you, define infrastructure as code in the AWS world. And so the reason that I keep bringing that up in Sam's case is, if I were to orchestrate all of the IAM permissions and other things that are required for the project that we're going to see in a minute, I would be writing a lot of CloudFormation myself. But instead of that, I was able to just write a simple template with SAM, and it turns it into that CloudFormation in the back end. And Newt, if there are other questions that are timely to the slides like that one, feel free to speak up or let me know. And I know I've seen some that are coming in that'll be great to answer at the end.
Yeah, can you speak to whether Terraform can be used instead of CloudFormation? Sure.
Well, yes, of course Terraform can be used. SAM specifically is from AWS and thus leverages CloudFormation. Of course, you could do all of the same things we're doing today with Terraform. It would just be, a little more code to write. And if nothing else, I'm a lazy developer, so SAM made that really easy for me. But of course, everything we're doing today, you could also do with Terraform. Okay, so sorry, I got a little off my slides, but that's okay. Like I said, it's much more fun if it's interactive, as much as I love hearing myself talk. So after that SAM deploy, our URL is public, and we're live on the internet, right? So we get this URL back that has our fantastic, amazing hello world function live and running, and that's great. But I think the question everyone has, even if they're not saying it, because maybe they're being nice, is, okay, but what would a real world application look like, Brendan? And when I've quoted real world here, I'm meaning, again, Lambda is fantastic. There's a lot of use cases where, you don't have a need for a lot of persistent storage or other services, and Lambda is a great fit for. But the real power of SAM is it brings the rest of the AWS stack to bear on your serverless application in a really easy to use way. So I think the number one question I had when I was starting out with it is, okay, well, what about persistent data, right? What if I want to use RDS or DynamoDB to have persistent data as part of my application? And so you can see here this URL, and we'll put it in the chat towards the end of the presentation as well, is the application that we're building today. And I just provided that so that you can have some example code after today. And what that's going to be is, again, not a super complex app, but one that shows off how SAM can bring in other parts of the AWS platform to bear against your application. And so for this application, we're just making a simple little serverless dad jokes application. For instance, if we were going to tell a Git dad joke, it might be, how do you get code for the bank vault? Well, you check out their branch. It's a fantastic GitLab dad joke, and everyone at GitLab loves it when I tell GitLab dad jokes, I promise you. So for this application, it's not going to be too complex. We're just going to have Lambda in front of our DynamoDB, which is going to be the data store for our dad jokes. And then we're going to allow users to both post new dad jokes and get a random dad joke back from our API. So again, this is just kind of a simple API, but it goes to show you how easy it is in the next steps that we follow to bring other AWS platform capabilities to bear on these apps. As I said, we're just going to add a new dad joke with a simple post and get a new dad joke, like why do football players like a lot of cereal for breakfast? Because they eat it from a Super Bowl, with a simple call to our two endpoints here. And so what that looks like, you can again see the code behind it there in the SAM app, but basically all we did was add to the template, the SAM template, hey, we also need DynamoDB with this. And then from there, our functions automatically had the ability to access those functions, the DynamoDB from the function. But again, even that isn't really the end game for an enterprise, right? The next thing an enterprise has to be concerned about is, okay, let's say we've got all the resources we need to bear to build a full function application, including serverless for those things that can be serverless. Let's have our whole API be serverless so that we're not paying for nodes to be up and paying for servers and managing servers we don't need. That's what we don't want to be doing. But now that we have that up and running, how do we leverage our team against it and really bring to bear all of the production grade CI/CD that we're going to need to build and maintain this application going forward? And so this is where I'm going to spend the most of my time, is talking about how we can bring AWS SAM and the power of GitLab CI/CD together to really, leverage professional grade CI against the SAM application. Because again, everything we saw up until now, I was deploying from my laptop, which is great for me. But if I've got other team members or I've got regulations that I need to adhere to before I deploy that code to production, I don't think dad jokes are that regulated. But if I was working in a regulated industry, then I would need to make sure that all of my proper gates and security gates were in place before we're deploying code to production. So in order to do that, we're going to want to, of course, automate that testing and deployment, right? That's the point of CI/CD. We'll create a GitLab CI YAML. We'll put our credentials for AWS in as CI/CD variables. We'll take a look at that. And then we'll leverage only and except to control the deployment so that we can have a very clear path to production. So just first, this is a little aside. We got a little meta with our build here because GitLab by default is going to use perform the builds inside of a Docker file. In fact, that's what our free compute on GitLab.com is going to assume, that you start from a Docker file to perform the build inside of. Of course, I can have my GitLab runner be anywhere. I can have it be my laptop. I can have it be somewhere else. But for simplicity's sake, it's nice to be able to just run an ephemeral build inside of a Docker container and have the output come out of that. Well, in this case, I have a couple prerequisites that I need for my build, right? I've installed them on my laptop, and that's great. But there's not an existing Docker Hub image that has everything I need, which is, Sam's going to need Python to function. I'm going to need Node because that's where my functions are built and deploying from. And then we'll need the SAM CLI installed as well. So this, to get that done, I made a meta step before my build, which was to build the Docker file for my build. So here you can see the Docker file where I'm bringing in, I'm starting from a Docker image that already has Python and Node built in, and then I'm adding to that the SAM CLI and a number of other AWS tools to make sure that it's ready to go, and then setting the working directory to the SAM CLI user before I get started on the rest of the build. So now that I have that, I need to allow CI/CD to be able to deploy to my AWS stack. So again, typically SAM is going to be using the credentials that are on my computer. So I've authenticated to AWS through the AWS CLI on my laptop. That stores my credentials in my user folder, as we see here. But the good news is SAM can also use environmental variables of the access key and secret access key. And GitLab allows me to put any variables that I want into the builds where I need them. So here you can see I've added those variables as CI/CD variables in GitLab. And then I've marked them both as both protected and masked. So I just want to talk about that real quick. Protected means that these variables will only be passed to protected branches. So for instance, if I have a repository out there where I'm deploying from the master branch, I wouldn't want a developer who is making a suggested change on another branch to be able to have access to these secret keys to be able to get them and do something in my AWS environment. And so by marking them as protected, these variables will only be passed to jobs on protected branches or tags in GitLab. And that's really valuable for that use case of, hey, I might have developers that are suggesting changes, but I don't want them to have access to the AWS environment. And then mask is just a simple mask that if I do accidentally echo out one of these variables in some command I run, GitLab will not print that into the logs. So just a little protecting myself from the whoops of echoing out one of those variables. Now, the other way I could do this is I could say, well, I don't want to have my secrets here. I might have them in Vault, and there's a number of articles we've written about how to integrate like HashiCorp Vault with GitLab, and we're bringing actually first-class integration soon to that. Or another option is to have a dedicated runner that has the correct IAM permissions to do this deploy. So how many enterprises will look at it is they'll say, okay, we'll have shared compute to do the building of jobs and run the tests and do all that great stuff. But when it comes to deployments, when it comes to those protected branches, we're going to do those specifically from specific runners that are inside the correct network and have the correct IAM permissions. And so that in that way, I can have protected runners where they only run code from protected branches. And then all of my checks and balances in the merge request have to have passed before that code gets even into the network where it's going to be deployed. So that may be a runner in a completely separate production VPC or somewhere else. And so this is just one way to do it. Again, it's the easy way. It was easy for me to get going with this, but hopefully that gives you a little flavor for the different ways that you can get your GitLab runner authenticated to AWS to allow for the deploy. And then the last thing I want to show is just the completed file, and we'll spend some time talking about what we're looking at here. So at the top, again, that's just me building the build image, meta, as we said before. I'm going to go into that meta directory, log on to the GitLab container registry, build the image, and push it into the GitLab container registry. And we'll talk about that only in just a second. And then we see the two jobs below, validate and deploy prod. And so let's talk about each of those. So validate happens at the test stage, excuse me, and it uses that image, the latest image of that from that registry file above. So this build is going to happen inside that Docker image that we created earlier on. And so it's going to have everything it needs. It's going to have the SAM CLI, Node, and Python ready to go. And so when I do a SAM validate, it's going to validate my that my template is ready to go. In production, I probably have a lot of other tests here, right? I might have some unit tests for my functions. Surprisingly enough, for the demo, I didn't write unit tests for my functions. I know everyone will be surprised about that. But this is, an example of how we can do some validation ahead of time on every branch and every change that's made to our application or to the template. Then finally, we have this deploy prod job that happens in the stage deploy. It's again using that same image from the registry from before. And then it's doing the same thing I did on my laptop, right? It's doing SAM build and SAM deploy. Again, it's going to have the AWS credentials because we put those in to our environmental variables, as we saw in the last step. Or again, maybe it's running on a runner that has the correct permissions to do the deploy. And we can see the only here is for references called master, right? So this is where I'm saying we're only going to do this deploy when code has been committed to master. So the validate step is going to happen on every commit, right? We're going to run tests against every commit to every branch, but we're only going to actually deploy the code when it comes to the master branch. And so we've got before that, all of our gates and security checks and review process and sign off that happens at the merge request level. And we're not looking at any of that today. You can find out a lot more about that on the rest of GitLab's documentation or other webinars, but we've got all of that happening before we're actually deploying the code. And then lastly, we've got this another only at the top that I skipped over in the build image job, and that says only changes meta/Docker file. So what this is doing is saying, I only want this job to run when I've made a change to the Docker file. So I don't need to rebuild that Docker image every time someone commits new code to the repository. I only need to do it if someone changes that Docker file because maybe, I forgot something, or we add a new dependency, right? Maybe someone wants to write a Java function next to my Node.js functions, and so we need to add, the ability for them to build that. And so that's how I've said, don't build the image every time, but only build a new latest build image when my Docker file changes. So that's great. And I see that there are a lot of fantastic questions coming in. So I would like to actually end it there and jump into those questions, because I know there's a lot of ideas and thoughts going around in the chat and in our Q&A section.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. I guess I will just start at the top and work my way down here. But have you seen real-time requirements where microservices are not a good fit, but monolithic?
Yeah, but a monolith would be. It's a good question. Ram, feel free to jump in if you have an opinion here. I would say that, yes, there are different requirements that, require maybe a monolith or something that's closer to a monolith, right? There's this new concept of a macro service that's basically a monolith in disguise in my mind. But I think that we're seeing more of this move towards microservices where it makes sense from a requirement standpoint because of what we talked about in the beginning, which is this need to ship quickly in order to be competitive. And so while microservices isn't a great fit for everything, I think that probably every monolith that's out there could benefit from some of its functionality being part of microservice, if that makes sense. For instance, would be GitLab itself, right? So GitLab's open source, and so you could even look at it over time. It started life out as a Ruby on Rails monolith, right? Because that's easy to get going and easy to have everyone contribute to. But as it's grown since its inception in 2011, a number of services have been pulled out. There's still a relatively large Ruby on Rails, probably monolith. I wouldn't call it a macro service. It's a monolith. But there's a lot of services that have been pulled out of that. There's almost 30, I think, for the ability to scale and change things without having to deal with that monolith. Ram, I don't know if you've got another opinion there.
Yeah, and the opinion is very similar. So I think there's always benefit in moving towards separating some of the components into services, because it reduces the complexity of one application. Of course, it introduces a couple of other things that you need to worry about: service discovery and managing all these independent services, and monitoring becomes a little bit more complex, as Brendan mentioned earlier. So yeah, there is a little bit more complexity for sure, but I think there's always a benefit of separating them so you can actually isolate the functionality to different services. If you don't mind, let me take another question here, which is, can say the artifact in S3 bucket when you do SAM build and deploy? The answer is yes. You can actually provide a S3 bucket in the package command, and then it actually store it there, and then you could deploy it from there. That's definitely possible. Brandon, do you want to add anything to that, or anything else you want to pick up? I have a couple other questions. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's really great. One question, and there's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of great questions. Another question I saw would be, would these demos and functions be capable in GitHub as well? So, or what's the difference between GitHub and GitLab? So the answer is, of course, yes. You could do a lot of what we saw today with GitHub. The biggest difference is, the maturity of GitLab CI/CD. So most folks that would be doing this with GitHub today would probably be using another tool for CI. has their actions, which is kind of like a CI/CD light. But GitLab has been in that CI/CD market for much longer, and actually has been proven to be an industry leader in that. So the nice thing about GitLab versus GitHub here is the ability to kind of have everything in a single application from the get-go. Another question I saw here, sorry, I'm looking at the ones. Ram, a good one for you. Does SAM work with PHP and runtime? Do you know?
I need to check on that, but it actually supports all the runtime which the Lambda supports, but I need to double check that. Yeah. I will take the next question as well, which is what the difference between AWS Cloud9 and SAM. Just to be clear, the AWS Cloud9 is an IDE that is available to you through your AWS account. SAM, or Serverless Application Model, is actually an extension to CloudFormation, as Brendan mentioned earlier, which actually helps you kind of define your serverless application in a more compact form, so you don't makes your development much easier. So that's actually, the SAM has two components to it. One of them is the definition of that template itself. And then, of course, a CLI, which you can use to build, deploy an application, local test, and so forth. So that's what SAM is. And the Cloud9 is an IDE, effectively, which is on the cloud.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. And I think you answered about the S3 bucket. That's really simple to allow that artifact to go to the S3 bucket. There's another question, Ram, I'd love you to take a stab at, which is the serverless framework CLI versus SAM. Do you have any opinions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, the serverless framework CLI, I'm very familiar with that as well. That actually has a very similar functionality to SAM. So we encourage people to use either. We are not saying, hey, this is AWS product versus this is partner product. Serverless is a advanced tier partner of ours, so they have very similar functionality. So you can use either one. They will both meet your needs. On top of it, if you don't mind, Brendan, let me take another question from here. From in a cybersecurity perspective, how do you secure serverless? So it is very similar to traditional as well. That, of course, it starts with proper identity management, authentication, and authorization. Use something like Cognito. You can use for authentication and authorization. So that starts with that. Obviously, the first is the identity management. The second thing, of course, is you have to do more about at the application level as well, things like input request validation, and the other one is the dependency and vulnerability management, also proper IAM, best practices across the board, and of course the other thing is the data encryption in transit and at rest. And also things like you still have to plan accordingly for DDoS attacks and stuff like that. But one thing that is that for instance, Lambda functions will scale. There's an attack to handle the traffic at the time, but of course you have to use still the web application firewall and things like that to protect upfront. But obviously these by nature the scaling and things will help you a little bit about that as well.
Great, that's really helpful. Yeah, I'm trying to group the questions here in our document together and things that make sense. So I think I'll take the next little group here. There's a couple questions that I'm going to try to answer together. So what is a runner? I should have defined that. Thank you for asking the question. Where are the commands launched? Is there anything to install locally? And a couple more Docker kind of based questions. So the runner is the agent that is actually running the commands in GitLab CI/CD. So you can learn a lot more about that if you go GitLab runner. There's lots of documentation out there. But it's basically an agent that's running this code. And so that could be, again, a Docker, a machine with Docker on it that is running inside a Docker container. It actually can use Docker machine to automatically spin up EC2 instances to run inside of. It could be a machine that you've kind of got dedicated, like I said, it could be an EC2 machine or something like that, you've got dedicated. We actually have a blog post coming out about the next version of GitLab this month that's going to support the runner in Fargate. So it's just an agent where the runner is, where the jobs are run. And so there's nothing to install locally because that's where the commands are launched, right? The commands run inside of this runner. And that's why I created that Docker file at the beginning, because then I had all of the, dependencies that I might need to install otherwise inside that Docker container ready to go. And then the next one is about, is there a documentation guide to that kind of step-by-step process? So yeah, there's a lot of guides out there for the GitLab CI YAML file, right? I kind of glossed over a lot of functionality there. We talked about the only and accept. We talked about, having those 3 jobs. But I would highly encourage you to look at both the GitLab documentation as well as the example CI YAML files that come with GitLab bundled in to see how those works. And then lastly, and then Ram, I've got a couple for you, is why should I go to GitLab from an existing Jenkins pipeline? That's a great question. If your Jenkins pipeline is working for you, maybe there's not a good reason. I know that the reason I ended up switching, actually before I worked at GitLab, I was a GitLab user. I had kind of like a whole stack of tools, GitLab, Jenkins, a lot of other stuff on either side of that from our DevOps lifecycle, was we were just spending so much time kind of managing and I say feeding and watering the Jenkins servers and agents. And that was spending a lot of my DevOps team's time was just kind of in managing that. When someone needed, a new version of Java installed and maybe it wasn't compatible with the one that was already on the agents we had to go spin up another one. You end up with a lot of Jenkins, I think they call them masters still, but the main servers, we ended up with multiple ones of those. It was really hard to manage that sprawl. Whereas GitLab CI/CD kind of came up in the time of Docker and cloud native. And so it really is, out of the box supportive of those kinds of technologies and just running inside of Docker containers is kind of its native way of working. I can still have dedicated machines and agents, like I said, and run those just as I would with Jenkins, but I have the flexibility to run elsewhere. Like I said, coming to Fargate soon, which I'm really excited about, so that we can, not have to manage the compute for my CI jobs. And then Ram, I think there's a couple others that would be great for you to answer about SAM and AWS.
Sure. Yeah, let me take them. Yeah, so the first thing is about, can you elaborate on how the serverless applications scale? So the serverless, take an example of, for instance, Lambda functions, right? So if there's an invocation, the Lambda function will get loaded and then executed, and it will stay warm for some time. If there's another invocation of that, it will actually run in the same environment. But if there's another invocation, while the first one is running, of course, it will instantiate another invocation and go in parallel. So it will scale as required, and if it scale down where it's not necessary. So this, you can look at it that way from each component. So that's the way it scales up and down as needed. And of course, if it is not used, and it will, you will not be built for that. The other question was about, what services do you generally see people using in serverless applications? Of course, it starts from serverless services such as Lambda functions, DynamoDB, and so forth. But also, it is very common for customers to use other services such as relational databases, which are not serverless as well, because in some cases it is required for them to use it. So people do use them in combination, although a lot of the applications tend to be more serverless than otherwise, but it is, I have some architectures where both kind of services are being used together as well.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful, Ram. And yeah, again, thank you everyone for all the great questions. We're not going to get to them. I promise you, Ram and I are trying our best to group and and answer as many as possible. There were dozens and dozens of questions, which is really great. There's fantastic I'm going to answer a couple more here in a second, but there's fantastic documentation on SAM. I didn't know anything about SAM before I put this demo together. I was able to use AWS's fantastic documentation for that. And I'll toot our own horn too. I think GitLab's documentation is really great too. If we don't get to your question, I apologize. We're really trying to answer all of them and group them as we can. So there are a couple other questions about, you know, kind of authentication with AWS, like how does IAM work with all this, and what other authentication you could use. So yes, again, I showed kind of the very simplistic method of authentication today, using the secrets and keys, but SAM and all the AWS CLI tooling, and then thus the runners for GitLab can use IAM, right? That's how we see a lot of folks actually deploy this in production. Is I'm going to have runners with scoped IAM permissions to deploy to the environments that I want them to. And that's how we're going to, you know, avoid having these kind of keys everywhere. You know, you're going to probably do that with Vault, or you're going to do it with IAM or a mixture therein to secure that in production. And the tooling from AWS and GitLab just kind of works out of the box with that. And that's more of an AWS thing than a GitLab thing, right? Like if you have a runner and it has the right IAM, was created with the right IAM permissions, that's the beauty of IAM is it will be able to run all those things that you expect it to. And so that, I think, answers a bunch of those questions. Ram, I don't know if there's other things you're seeing that you'd like to touch on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, I think I see that I could pick up.
Yeah, and there's a lot of questions about like using other cloud providers or other CI/CD tooling. I mean, I would say that the principles we talked about here will apply a lot of those places. So, you know, today it's specifically we're presenting AWS and GitLab. Of course, Ram and I are both biased. We think that we've solved a lot of these problems in a great these different problem sets in a great way. But you know, the principles that Ram talked about and I talked about in the beginning, it applies no matter what kind of your tool set is, or your backend is. I would just encourage everyone to, you know, think about those tools and those providers, because you know you want to be with folks that are really considering these real world use cases, right? I think SAM is a great example of AWS doing that. I think for GitLab CI/CD, you know, the concept of a single application and not having, you know, a massive tool stack that we've got to maintain. Those are our answers to it. But you know, I think that these principles of deploying and understanding how to architect your application apply no matter what you're using. I'm trying to see, and feel free, any of the other moderators, to speak up if there's questions that we're not haven't covered yet. Like I said, I tried to cover all the IAM ones. There's a question, Ram, about like, is there a limitation of the data that works with Lambda? I'm not aware of one, but maybe you could answer that. Like, is there any limitation of the data that we're able to access from Lambda functions?
No, the Lambda functions have the similar privileges as any other application code that you can run. We would of course ask you to follow the standard IAM best practices and all those kind of stuff, but it doesn't have any specific restrictions as to what you can access from data perspective.
Great. I assumed that was the answer, but it's always good to hear it. Another question here is, can SAM build and SAM deploy be used for server-based deployments too, or just serverless? You know, I think that my answer would be, and I'll let Ram, you take a stab at this too. I mean, I think SAM is built kind of from the ground up to enable serverless in your applications. But again, the thing I really like about it is it gives me access to the rest of the AWS stack. I don't know if I would deploy to EC2 from it, but like for using other AWS services, you know, it's a great kind of best of both worlds, right? Get started with serverless, bring to bear, you know, the other persistent storage capabilities of AWS to it. I don't know, Ram, if you have another opinion there.
Yeah. So the serverless application model, again, as I mentioned earlier, is it's built on top of CloudFormation. Yes. So technically, anything works in CloudFormation works as well. But if you're just developing a traditional application, you would be fine with CloudFormation as your infrastructure as code tool. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Great. Thanks. Yeah, just I'll take maybe one or two more questions here. Again, I apologize if we didn't get your question. Thank you so much. You can find us on the internet. You can get me at Twitter at O'Leary Crew. Happy to keep the conversation going. Another question was about getting around limitations of Docker on Windows. So I'm assuming that's relative towards, the CI/CD aspect of GitLab. That's something that we're spending a lot of time working on. So we recently released an executor for Docker on Windows specifically. So I'd highly encourage you to take a look at that. There's really great documentation around that and the ability to use Docker on Windows in order to build and deploy your jobs as well. And then Ram, maybe one last question for you. It's asking about using Amplify to create Lambda functions. What would your opinion be about sticking with Amplify or maybe moving some of that to SAM? Like how would you, I have this question too, is why I'm asking it. How would you compare and contrast those two solutions?
Yeah, I have to admit that I'm not very in-depth with Amplify. I probably wouldn't take a stab at it right now. Yeah.
Hey, no problem. Yeah, I love Amplify too, and I'm new to SAM, so that's good. I think again, it's different use cases. My understanding of Amplify is, hey, that's more geared towards mobile developers. But again, there's probably a use case for a mixed environment. There's probably a use case for both. So I think that's all the time we have for questions today. Again, thank you so much to everyone for participating. Note, I don't know if we have any closing remarks. Let me know.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone logging in and engaging in this conversation. We really hope you have a good rest of your week. Take care of yourselves, be safe. And yes, we will be sending an email in the next couple of days that will link to this recording in the slides. So do not fret, you will have access to that. And yeah, and just take care. We hope that you join us again soon.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.